This week on PA Books, the author of Their Life's Work, Gary Pomerantz.
Gary Pomerantz, author of Their Life's Work, The Brotherhood of the 1970s Pittsburgh Steelers Then and Now. Why'd you call the book Their Life's Work?
You know, it was an expression that Chuck Noll, the head coach of the team, used. And he used it all the time. And he actually got it from his coach, Paul Brown, back in Cleveland in the 50s. And what Paul Brown would say is when he was about to release a player, he'd gather with the player and he would say, if you were my son, I would tell you it's time to get on with your life's work. Noll brought that to Pittsburgh with him, that phrase, but he used it in different ways. And every one of these interviews I conducted for this book with former Steelers, it came up. I mean, it was that deeply ingrained. Some player took it as a death knell of their career with the Steelers. They were done. But others took it more constructively as a call to action. John Stallworth, for instance, the wide receiver, went back and got his MBA and then went off after he retired from the Steelers and built an information technology firm in the aerospace industry and sold it for $69 million. A great success story in business. Pretty good wide receiver, too. But what Noll was saying, I think, was that football is a tough game. It's a brutal game. And you're only one play away from being done. Then what do you do? To Noll, life's work was not football. It was what came next.
You a Steelers fan?
No, I'm really not a fan of any team, and it probably comes from growing up in the press box as a sports writer. No cheering in the press box, as they say. Objectivity. I'm a fan of the game to a point. In some ways, I'm a bit ambivalent about football. I'm troubled by the concussions and some of these life-altering injuries. But I also see why those stadiums fill up. I understand why these billion-dollar television contracts keep rolling in like the waves, because there's something remarkable about the game. It's a sensory overload. And these athletes are remarkable. I watched a game the other day. I see a 6'7", 300-pound defensive lineman run diagonally 35 yards across the field and tackle this little running back. And I thought, wow. And the broadcasters didn't even comment on it. We just accept this stuff. There's art, there's the aesthetics of it, there's strategy, and there's some mean hits.
You've been a sports writer?
I was a sports writer for about the first dozen years of my career. I started out as a newspaper guy at the Washington Post. I covered pro football there, and and then about 20 years in all as a daily journalist, and started writing about politics and other things.
Well, how do you cover a team year after year, and can you cover a team year after year and not care whether they win or lose?
Well, it's a question that sports editors have been asking for a long time, because it's a trick for a sports writer. It's a science, and it's hard to pull off. You want to get to know the people you're covering well. You want them to trust you, and you need to trust them. And so you got to get close enough to get the goods, to get the story, but you need to keep enough distance so that you're not conflicted, you're not compromised. And there's a feeling that a reporter should only cover a team or a beat, politics, business, whatever, for about 2 years. Then they've become too close and they need to move on to something else. Other people feel like you can go for 20 years, 30 years.
Are there players that you found yourself really liking and players you didn't like as people, and that affected your writing?
Well, I never covered the Pittsburgh Steelers, I should say. I covered the Washington Redskins for a few years for the Washington Post in the early 1980s. And, I'm human. There are guys who I like very much and other guys who are kind of hard to deal with. Does that, color my writing one way or another? I hope not. I hope not, because the reader deserves better. And it's not about my feelings for these guys, whether I like them or not. They're professionals, and I'm a professional. So, it's been a lot of years since I've been a daily sports writer. It's been almost a quarter century now. So you're taking me back, but I think about this stuff still because I teach journalism at Stanford in the graduate program of journalism there. And some of these issues are forever, about keeping yourself close enough and yet far enough from being compromised.
So why did you pick the Steelers to write about?
Well, because they are the greatest team since the Earth's crust cooled. You know, they were remarkable, and I visited them for the first time as a young, impressionable 20-year-old sports writing intern at the Washington Post. Dream assignment: go to Latrobe, St. Vincent College, and write a story about this dynasty of the 70s.
When was it you went there?
1981, summer of '81. Was it done? Was it finally done? You know, they'd won the 4 Super Bowls in 6 years between '74 and January of '80, and nearly all the stars were still there. I interviewed Terry Bradshaw and John Stallworth, Franco Harris, Lynn Swann, Chuck Noll. I remember sitting with Mean Joe Greene, sweltering August day, and he was in a T-shirt and shorts, and as Joe Greene is talking, I'm thinking, you know, this guy's bicep is wider than my thigh. And they were all great interviews. They had such swagger. They were special. They were historic. They knew it.
And they treated you as a professional, even though you were a 20-year-old kid?
Yeah, I mean, as a sports writer from the Washington Post. So, you know, they were talking to a 20-year-old, but it was the Washington Post. And as I recall, they treated me with great respect. You know, I mean, they were interviewed all the time. I was another guy. I'm sure I wasn't memorable to them, but they were very memorable to me because, you know, this was a team with just this arresting array of talent and personality, and even a 20-year-old couldn't miss that. So that's really where the seed for this book was planted. And now, all these years later, at a time when football's under the microscope for its violence, for concussions, I thought, you know, if I were to take on the game for what it gives players and what it takes from them, who better to use as a case study than the greatest team I ever saw? Those men I met in Latrobe in 1981, 32 years ago.
So what approach did you decide to take?
Interview. Talk to everyone, read everything, and it's hard when they don't know you. And so I had to reach out to them, and I was greatly helped by the former publicist of that team, Joe Greene, who was always one of the best in the business. And I had to explain to Joe my ambition was to tell this story of this empire, move across time with the team, across the decades, to follow their lives. And in writing about the Steelers, I would be writing essentially about the game of football.
Anybody not talk to you?
Yeah, there were a few guys who just didn't respond at all. I seem to be asked everywhere, what about Lambert? Did Jack Lambert talk to you? The answer is no. I tried to get to Lambert. I had his number, called him, and I had scripted a little note what I wanted to say. I got his answering machine. Hi, this is Jack, leave a message. Beep. So I started to leave my message. Jack, this is Gary Pomerantz. I'm a writer in San Francisco, and I heard beep, cut off. I said, okay, Lambert, you want to play like that? So I thought about it, dialed that number again, listening, and hi, this is Jack, leave a message. And I said, hi, Jack, this is Gary Pomerantz. I'm calling from San Francisco, here's my number. And you know, and he did not return the call. Lambert doesn't return most media calls, but his presence is large in the book because the guys were all talking about him. He was a memorable figure. And, you know, even nowadays, when you go to a game in Heinz Field, as I did not long ago, I stood by gate D for about an hour, maybe 2 hours before game time. And I counted the number of fans who came through wearing a Steeler jersey, a replica jersey from those players of the 70s. 133 fans were wearing those jerseys. 61 of them, almost half, Jack Lambert jerseys. So that devotion, that love for Lambert still lives.
You say in the book that you interviewed Terry Bradshaw, and he said, now listen, this is the last time I'm going to talk about this. Is it really the last time he's going to talk about it, or does he say that?
Well, I'm sure it's not. I mean, Terry Bradshaw, that's what he does. He talks about Terry Bradshaw. He talks about football. I interviewed him at a very nice hotel in Beverly Hills, where I found him registered under the name of Gary Cooper, which I thought was a nice Hollywood touch. And Terry Bradshaw's a great interview. You know, he's all in. And I remember he was sitting here, I was sitting here, and he's very tactile. So he'd be saying something, and he sort of smacked me in the back, my shoulder here, like, know what I mean? And I kept going. And I'm thinking, now I know why these guys were shoulder pads. So I would sort of turn a little bit like this. And, Terry's story is complicated with the Steelers because, we think of him now, he's a Hall of Famer. He won 4 Super Bowls, twice named Most Valuable Player of the Super Bowl. And there's this great brotherhood now among teammates. And he's somewhat outside of that brotherhood. The guys would all love for him to come back into the huddle. But, Terry has some hard feelings about his years in Pittsburgh.
Toward his teammates or the fans?
No, not towards the teammates at all. A little bit towards the fans, a little bit towards his coach, Chuck Noll. One of the revelations for me in working on this research was to really understand how hard Terry Bradshaw was hit during his time here. And by that, I'm not even talking about by opposing defenses. I'm talking about by the press, locally and across the nation, belittling and mocking his intellect. He was little Abner, the Southern boy, who had a scarecrow's brain. Never mind that he was one of the few quarterbacks who was calling his own plays at that time. And then there was his relationship with Chuck Noll, how hard he was hit by Noll. Just as a mayor's most important relationship is with his or her police chief, a head coach's most important relationship is with his quarterback. And Chuck Noll did not manage that relationship particularly well in those early years.
You tell a story where I didn't note what the setup was, but Bart Starr talking to Vince Lombardi.
Mm-hmm.
And Bart Starr had gone in and complained about something Lombardi did, and you said, Bradshaw decades later said, I could never, nor would I have gone in to speak with Noll as Starr had with Lombardi. I was afraid of my coach. Terry Bradshaw was afraid of his coach.
Yeah, and you think about the guys who were rushing the passer, and he was the passer, and they were coming after him. He should have been afraid of them. But this is the thing about Chuck Noll. Chuck Noll had an open door, but he had a closed personality. He was not a warm, fuzzy guy. Most football coaches aren't. Chuck Noll was an up from the bootstraps Clevelander. He was, working class, childhood during the Depression. Then he starts playing in the NFL, and his teammates, many of them had fought in World War II and in Korea. And so in the locker room, when they were telling those guys, war stories, these were real war stories. At the end, you were alive or not. And so he was like a serious, sober kind of guy. And his players feared him. They respected him, but there was an element of fear too. He could give him a look. He'd shoot him a look and freeze him. And Terry Bradshaw struggled with Noll. He told me there were times I hated the man. But he said, I realized years later that, I was immature and I needed to be toughened. And he made me ultimately into a man. So there is that respect there, but, there's still distance there. And it's a bit of a shame because of all that Bradshaw meant to that team then and still today.
Well, you also tell a story about a time when Terry Bradshaw was knocked down and he was injured and the fans cheered because he was injured.
1973, it happened against Cincinnati at Three Rivers Stadium. And he was hit hard. And he got up holding his shoulder, half bent over, just wincing. And he heard this horrific sound, cheering. Steeler fans cheering. Their quarterback is hurt. He's in pain. And Art Rooney Sr., the chief as he was known, the owner of the team, and Joe Greene were sickened by the sound. I mean, how can you be cheering when this guy's hurt? All he's trying to do. Terry Bradshaw was the first round pick, number 1 pick in the entire NFL draft, 1970. He came here with trumpets blaring. One scout said, this guy's like Xerox stock. Only one comes along every 20 years. That dates it a little bit, Xerox stock. But it was true. He was big. He had this great physical gift. He was tough. He could throw the ball 75 yards in the air. And it really, it took 7 years for him to become an All-Pro for the first time. And some of that is due to Chuck Noll. You raised a Lombardi story. It was in Bart Starr's second year in a practice. He threw an interception. Lombardi chewed him out. Starr went to see him after practice in his office, closed his door, sat down and said, "Coach, please don't ever do that to me again. If you're going to verbally whip me, don't do it in front of the guys. I can't lead this team if you do that." And as Starr retells the story, Lombardi listened and said, "I understand." And he never did it again. And their relationship rose to a new level. And so too the fortunes of the Green Bay Packers. And that's where Terry said, I couldn't have done that with Chuck because I didn't have the confidence then. But Chuck wasn't the kind of guy you had that conversation with either.
But Terry Bradshaw was the first-round draft pick, but he wasn't necessarily the designated quarterback from day one. He had to compete with other quarterbacks.
Well, it's true, and in the but he was certainly expected to be the guy. I mean, there's first-round pick, and then there's the guy who's the first pick in the entire draft. Teams had been offering veteran players and other draft picks in a trade to get Terry Bradshaw, and they decided, no, we're going to keep him. We're going to go after this guy and get him. And it was in 1974, and people don't remember this now, but the first Super Bowl year for the Steelers, Terry Bradshaw did not start the first 6 games of that season. Joe Gilliam did, and Gilliam then struggled, and Bradshaw was brought back in the 7th game. He struggled a little bit. Terry Hanratty started a couple games, and then it went back to Terry finally, and the team won the Super Bowl, and it was his team to quarterback for the rest of the decade.
I want to ask you about Chuck Noll again. Was he really a good coach, or with those players that they had assembled, could anybody have coached them?
I think it's safe to say he was a great coach. I mean, look at the results, and in all those surveys that are done, the polls among sports writers and NFL films, he's always ranked in the top 5. Excuse me, and he won 4 Super Bowls, right? And it's always said about a coach who has great players, well, anybody could do that. Anybody couldn't do that. It's hard work, and he also was a part of the draft. He comes to this team in 1969, and at that first practice at Latrobe, the players are bounding out. It's the same old guys they've had. And Noll says, look, I've reviewed the game films from last year. You guys aren't very good. You're not fast enough. You're not strong enough. Your technique is deficient. Most of you guys will be gone soon. And they were. 5 years later, they were in the Super Bowl. Only 5 players were left who had heard that original speech.
He was 1-13 in his first year?
1-13.
Was there any time that his job was in jeopardy in the beginning?
No, and Art Rooney Sr. made an interesting point at the end of that first season. When they won the first game and then lost the remaining 13, they played 14-game season then, the Chiefs said, Chuck lost those games, but he never lost his team.
Speaking of Art Rooney Sr., what influence, what role did he play with the team in the 70s? Was he still actively involved?
He was sort of a sage Irish uncle. He was the beloved founder. Beloved because he was a great character, and he always said something kind to the players. Go up to Frenchie Fuqua in the locker room after the game, say, Frenchie, that was a fine play you made. It reminded me of Johnny Blood, and played years before, decades before, with the team, and Frenchie just turned. He was aglow. I mean, a kind word from the chief, praise like that was, pennies from heaven. That was the Chiefs' way. But it was in the 60s when he began to finally turn over the team to his son, Dan. People tend to forget, people from outside of Pittsburgh anyway, this was a terrible football franchise for 40 years. I mean, that's a long time to be bad. 40 years. They were awful. They'd never won a playoff game. But sports writers loved the Chief because he told great stories. He was a horse player. He was one of the best horse players, gamblers at the track this country had for decades. And, he had he was Irish Catholic, up from the streets of the north side, lived a few blocks from the ballpark. And he was, an archetype of that period of the early 20th century. He was tough, and he was a boxer for a while. He played baseball and football. And, he had his leather-bound prayer book in one hand and the Daily Racing Form in the other. I mean, they don't make them like that anymore.
But it was on his watch that the 1955 Steelers released Johnny Unitas in spring training, you say, without playing him for a single down during preseason.
Oh, well, there goes the best quarterback ever. We don't need him. Yeah, I mean, it was one folly after another in the middle 50s. They could have drafted Jim Brown and Lenny Moore, and they did draft John Unitas, as you say, who was local from Pittsburgh, and they cut him. They did draft Len Dawson, a future Hall of Famer, but they trade him. I mean, it was one calamity after another. And the chief would hire his buddies, cronies, to be a head coach. And they lost, and he was a lovable loser. But then he turned it over to Dan.
Was Dan the one who spurred the turnaround?
Oh, no question. He turned it into a professional organization. And his younger brother, Art Jr., took over the scouting department. And, you know, I mean, if you look at the legacy, the NFL legacy of the chief and Dan, you know, the chief helped this league, the NFL, survive player shortages during the war years and money shortages. It was like he rode that stagecoach with the league into the modern day. And then Dan takes over, and he you know, the chief kept his office in his coat pocket, rubber banded together with all his notes and tax forms. And Dan made this a smooth running management team, and he took it like it was like the rocket ship going to the stars with the NFL, with billion-dollar contracts with television, and you know, 111 million people across the world watching Super Bowls.
You write about Art Jr. and the role he played in scouting. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, you know, Dan and Art Jr. could not be more different. Dan was schooled as an accountant, and Art Jr. was a method actor and went to New York and wanted to, his dream was to perform at Actors Studio. Didn't meet the dream, but they couldn't be more different. They look very different. Dan is very small and angular. Art is much bigger, broader, and you know, the gene pool is vast. And Art's role was first to sell tickets, and then he wanted to do more. He wanted to make his mark, and he decided, how about scouting? And his father said, whatever, sure, scouting. And he worked hard at it, very hard at it. And in 1974, specifically, January 29th of 1974 was the greatest day of that decade for this team. It was a draft day. It had nothing to do with the field. The Steelers drafted 4 future Hall of Famers in the first 5 rounds. Think about that. 4 future Hall of Famers in 5 rounds. It had never been done before. Hasn't been done since. They drafted Lynn Swann from USC, Jack Lambert from Kent State, John Stallworth from Alabama A&M, a historically black college, and Mike Webster from Wisconsin. And Chuck Noll, who was very involved with the draft as well, called it our draft of exceptions. And by that he meant, you know, they all had a knock against him. Swann was too small. Lambert was too skinny. Stallworth, he was too obscure. He played for Alabama A&M. Only 1,500 people watched his games. And Webster was also too small. They figured he was just there, somebody wrote in the day after the draft, just to handle snaps during training camp. And they all become Hall of Famers. Art Rooney, that was his draft. It was a masterpiece.
Does he get enough credit for what he did, or?
Well, in short, no. No, he doesn't. And it's always hard with scouting because it's teamwork. There are multiple scouts. Dick Haley was there, Bill Nunn was there, and Art Rooney Jr. Art Rooney Jr. was running the show, though. It was his department at that time. So he should get more credit and certainly merits consideration for the Hall of Fame.
And yet his brother fired him later on.
He did. That was much later on. That was 1987. That was a tough moment in the family, particularly for Art Jr., because this had been his life. And, you know, in the 80s, the Steelers were measuring themselves, and their fans were measuring them against the 70s, when, you know, all heaven broke loose here in Pittsburgh, and they won 4 Super Bowls, and they had 9 Hall of Fame players, 4 of them in that draft alone. You don't replicate that, particularly when you're drafting lower and lower and lower in order. By the way, the most remarkable fact about drafting 4 Hall of Famers, in 1974, the Steelers picked 21st out of 26 teams, so it makes it even more amazing. But the 80s weren't as kind, and they weren't terrible. They were okay, roughly 500, winning half, losing half. But Dan made a move in 1987, and he called his younger brother into his office and told him that he was done. And that's hard to do when it's not a family member, but when it's your younger brother.
And a co-owner of the team, right?
Yeah, the 5 Rooney sons each had 16% of the team at that point, a total of 80%, and their cousins owned 20%, the remaining 20%. But it wasn't about ownership here. It was about raw pride. This was Art Jr.'s life's work. He put all of himself into this. And Dan made a management decision.
You mentioned Bill Nunn in part of the drafting, and he plays a role in your book. Can you explain about Bill Nunn, who he was?
He's one of the unsung heroes of those years of empire. Bill Nunn was a newspaper man. That's why I really love him. I love newspaper men, having been one once. He worked for the Pittsburgh Courier. He was the man from the Courier, and he had been the sports editor of the Courier for about 2 decades. And each year he'd been producing this black colleges All-American team. And some NFL teams would call him, say, you mentioned this guy here, tell us about him, or tell us about that guy. But the Steelers never called, and it really bothered Bill Nunn because he was in Pittsburgh, publishing in Pittsburgh, and the home team didn't call. Well, Dan Rooney called him into his office and told him, we'd like to hire you. We noticed this team. You produce every year the All-American team of black colleges. And Bill Nunn wasn't initially interested in it, but a deal was cut where he would work part-time. And boy, did it pay dividends. Soon they hired him full-time. And now the Steelers had not just Bill Nunn, but his access and his entree to those coaches in the historically black colleges. And so in the years that follow, you see the Steelers drafting Mel Blount and L.C. Greenwood and Ernie Holmes, and they got Donnie Shell from South Carolina State. The list is long. Joe Gilliam from Tennessee State. And if you remove Bill Nunn, it would have like a Swiss cheese effect on that team. All of those guys would not be there.
You write that players such as Greenwood, Blount, Frank Lewis, and Ernie Holmes had never had white teammates, and Bradshaw had never known a black teammate. Did integration go smoothly with the players and with the fans?
Well, this is what I love about a work like this. We all remember 1970s, right? We lived it. But I had to tell these guys, to me, that they were historical figures. To young people today, like my kids, it all bleeds together. 60s, 70s, 80s. Lincoln was president, then the Immaculate Reception, then Reagan took office, right? and so think of where we were as a nation in 1960 versus, say, 1975. A lot's going on with Dr. King's, freedom movement, the civil rights movement, and everyone brings their biographies into that locker room, and they're all thrown together. And as you say, those players from the historically black colleges had never had white teammates. Terry Bradshaw from Louisiana Tech had never had a black teammate. There were, off-color humor. That's the way it works in the locker room. You joke with each other, and they had a lot of fun with it. Frenchie Fuqua, John Fuqua was a running back from who had grown up in Detroit. But he told the story that he'd been a French count who was sunning on the the French Riviera. He awoke one morning from snoozing out there in the sun, and he realized he turned black. So he said he became Count Frenchie Fuqua, lived as Negro royalty, and he tells his stories well. But they all brought their histories there, and it did work well. They did find their way. Sports has a way of doing that. There's a common cause, right? You're all in this for a purpose, to win. And when they started to win, well, then it's pure harmony, right?
What was football like in the early 1970s, 1969, 1970, compared to the way it is today?
Tough guys who didn't train year-round. Many of them had second jobs because the average salary in the NFL in 1970 was $23,000. So Elsie Greenwood was working as a substitute teacher in junior high school, and Rocky Blyer was selling insurance, and Andy Russell was working in the investment business. They were all finding their way. It's a little different than today. And to me, what I realized as I got deeper into this book, it was a story about the brotherhood. It was a story about how close they were, because that was the pre-free agency era. So those Steelers were teammates for 10 years and more. Today's players, move like grasshoppers team to team. And they're chasing bigger contracts, which we all understand. But the cost of that is they're not going to have relationships like the Steelers of the 70s. There's a great stat. If you take 8 players on that team, Terry Bradshaw, Donnie Shell, Joe Greene, Elsie Greenwood, Swan and Stallworth, Jack Lambert, Jack Ham, those 8 guys played 100 seasons in the NFL, a full century's worth. Every one of them as members of the Pittsburgh Steelers. So that means they knew each other. They knew each other intuitively. They knew the women they loved, the cigarettes they smoked, their favorite brand of beer. Lambert, by the way, Michelob. Always bottles, never cans. And that translated onto the field. They knew where the other guy was going to be. There was a closeness there. There was just an understanding. They didn't have to give voice to it. And that really helped lift that team. And that brotherhood has moved across the decades when they've grown older and had, suffered some hard times, some of them, many early deaths.
They stay together, stay in contact?
Many of them live here in the Pittsburgh area still. And, I saw this brotherhood in 100 ways and more. I saw it in a conversation with Joe Greene talking about Dwight White's passing. And he was recalling how Franco Harris had called him from Pittsburgh. Joe was in Texas. Franco called from the hospital and said, he's gone. And Joe was telling me the story, and he was inhabiting that moment again. And he was just looking into the distance, and he said, he's gone. And it was like it was happening again, and the tears are welling up in his eyes. I saw the brotherhood in the way Donnie Shell's kids called John Stallworth Uncle John, and Stallworth's kids call Shell Uncle Donnie. I saw it in the way Franco Harris hosts these annual dinners, not annual, but big anniversary dinners for the Immaculate Reception, which happened in 1972. He hosted one on the 25th, the 30th, last year the 40th. And he brings his teammates back together with their wives. And Franco and his wife Dana give out keepsakes to commemorate the occasion. Once it was pearl necklaces for the wives. Last year it was cut glass footballs from Tiffany's with, inscribed for the occasion. Franco foots the entire bill. He just wants to bring everybody back and to celebrate not only what they had, but the time that they have left. That's the focus. John Stallworth, a very introspective guy. Franco Harris, very introspective guy. Both of them say, that's where we are now. We need to celebrate the time we had together years ago, but also the time we have left.
Is that unusual for sports teams who were together for a championship period of time to stay tight like that?
You hear it sometimes about Lombardi's Packers. I've heard about that. You have to go back in time to meet that equation you just laid out there. That teams that stay together for a long time. Well, when's the last time a team stayed together for a long time in professional sports in America? It's been a while. It's the price of free agency, and so you need to go back. And this book for me became very much a study of how differently a man looks at himself in his 20s, and most of the players were in their 20s and their 70s, versus his 50s and 60s. When you're in your 20s, you're bulletproof, you're invincible, and life is eternal, right? You look at 50 and 60 through a telescope. It's like a faraway planet, it's your father's world. But when you're in your 60s, as these guys are today, you have a lot more experience, a lot more wisdom, context for your life, how it all fits together. This life is not forever. And you begin to treasure those deep friendships. And really, that was probably the single biggest takeaway for me. I now, cherish my deep friendships more because of watching these guys. I mean, what they had in their friendship and what they still have, we should all be so lucky to have.
How many of them have had some success in their post-football careers, and how many of them have not?
Well, it depends how you define success, right? It can be measured in many different ways. A good number of them have done great. F. Scott Fitzgerald said famously, there are no second acts in American lives. Well, Terry Bradshaw sure has had a second act, and John Stallworth has sure had a second act. I mean, a number of them have done well. Some of them have, not so. Joe Gilliam, the quarterback who started the first 6 games of that season, African-American quarterback. Very thin, he was built like olive oil, spindly, but he threw the ball sweetly, and he was the quarterback for the first 6 games, and then he found his way into drug use, heroin at that time.
You describe a scene where he's doing heroin just before a game.
Right, and he struggled with drug addiction through his life and died at 49 from an accidental cocaine overdose. Some surprises. Ernie Holmes, Fats as they used to call him, he once shaved his hair into the shape of an arrowhead, and people started calling him Arrowhead Holmes. And Ernie used to say that the arrow pointed him towards the quarterback, and he was a defensive tackle. He had struggles in his life, and he ended up being a minister, a 688-pound minister, and later had this gastric bypass surgery, lost a few hundred pounds.
But he also went through a time where he had some mental disturbances and shot at a police helicopter.
He did, and Ernie Holmes was a guy many of his teammates feared, because he would be playing around with him, horsing around in the locker room physically, and he would unwittingly hurt him. He was a bear of a man. I mean, he was strong. So the stories I heard about Ernie Holmes almost all involved 3 things: barbecued meats, Courvoisier, and rage. And sometimes all in the same story. And, it's hard to believe now, but Ernie Holmes is gone, Dwight White is gone, and as of a month ago, L.C. Greenwood. So Joe Greene is now the only surviving member of the original Steel Curtain front 4.
Can you talk about Joe Greene a little bit? I learned from your book that the Coke commercial took 120 takes.
And Joe kept drinking that Coke down. Now, what you see is not in the commercial is not the normal Coke bottle. Because Joe's hand was so big, they had specially made bottles, and they were bigger. And Joe felt like, okay, they're paying me $35,000 for this commercial. They're paying me to endorse their product. I don't want to just spit out the Coke when they say cut and they're going to go to a new take. Even though they had like a spittoon there for him, they had a bucket, and he wouldn't do it. So he kept drinking it down. Well, then he had problems with the lines because he kept belching. And every time he belched, the little boy would say, "You fumbled." The problem was the little boy was struggling with his lines. But the interesting thing about that commercial is it transformed the perception of Mean Joe Greene. He was voted the 13th greatest player in NFL history by NFL Films, but I think everyone would agree it is the very best nickname in NFL history. Everyone, Joe would say at the Pro Bowl the year after that commercial, little kids would run past the quarterbacks and the running backs, the marquee players, to him and say, "Throw me your jersey, Joe, throw me your jersey," as he did in the commercial. Little old ladies would say, "Hi, Mean Joe." Suddenly they realized there was a good guy beneath the reputation, beneath the nickname.
You tell a story about there's Pearls. Who is Pearls? P-E-R-L-E-S?
Read on.
It's a coach. Is
Perlis, George Perlis.
Perlis. Berlin, the trainer, once saw Holmes standing next to Perlis on the Steelers' sideline. "What the hell are you doing here?" Perlis asked, demanding to know why Holmes had left the defensive huddle. Holmes replied, "Joe threw me out of the game." Perlis, incredulous, said, "What do you mean?" Holmes said, "I wasn't playing defense, and Joe said if I wouldn't do it, get the hell out." Perlis said, "Get the hell back in there." Holmes said, "No, I'm not going back until Joe tells me it's okay." So a player in the team is overruling the coach.
Joe was the sheriff of the county, and the county was the locker room. He led by the force of his personality.
Yeah, how do you get to that point that you're the team leader and other people on your team, your peers?
Well, it happened quickly. Remember, this is an alpha world, and so you do it through your manhood. Joe Greene held out in 1969 when he was drafted, and then when he came in to training camp, finally signed, he was a little out of shape. And they had a drill called the Oklahoma drill, where a defensive player would be down in a three-point stance going against an offensive lineman who would snap the ball, and bam, they would collide, and they would, or a quarterback or a coach playing a quarterback would hand the ball to a running back, and the running back had to run through this very tight space. And the goal for the defensive player was to shed the tackle, or the block, I should say, and make the tackle of the running back as he came through. Well, the vets couldn't wait to get their hands on this Joe Greene, you know, holding out. Who does he think he is, rookie like that? So it started with Ray Mansfield, who was known as the Old Ranger. He was much loved center, veteran, tough guy. So it's Joe Greene against Mansfield. And in that first snap, Greene just picks up Mansfield and throws him aside like he's a little rag doll, and just, you know, smacks into the running back and drops him. And there, you know, usually there's howls and cheers, but this is the Old Ranger. This is Ray Mansfield is just tossed. Silence. So now the next guy comes in, Bruce Van Dyke, same thing, tosses him. Joe crushes the running back. L.C. Greenwood told me that he had seen all the guys lining up to get their shot at Joe, but now he saw the guys moving secretly to the back of the line because they didn't want any part of Joe Greene. And so that's, in football, how you build your cred. You know, your credibility is based on performance. And Joe Greene was a straight shooter. The coaches loved him because he kept everyone straight in the locker room. To Joe, it was always about the team.
Did you interview him for this book?
Oh, yes.
What's he like?
Well, it was a fantastic interview. You know, I went to see him. One of the interviews was at his home outside of Dallas. And I had brought a DVD with me of two games, the 1974 AFC title game played at Oakland and Super Bowl IX. And at one point when Joe was sitting, you know, in his couch and the 1974 AFC title game is playing, I casually mentioned, I said, you know, Joe, it's not on film here, but this was the game where you kicked Jim Otto between his legs and dropped him. Otto was the future Hall of Famer, the center for the Raiders. And Agnes Greene, Joe's wife, was sitting there, a wonderful lady. She says, "Oh, Joe would never do that, and certainly not to Jim." And Joe's just staring at the screen. He's just going to let the comments pass. Well, then Super Bowl IX, we popped that in, the DVD. And there's a moment when the Steelers start moving ahead in the third quarter. And I look over at Joe, and Joe starts chanting, "Here we go, Steelers, here we go." He's like a kid. I mean, he was young again. Frankly, it was beautiful to see.
So Chuck Noll takes over as coach in 1969. They're 1-13. When does it start looking like they're improving?
Well, you can see there are improvements with each year. After 1-13, you know, they moved to 5-9, 6-8, and Bradshaw's still struggling a little bit. They have a good draft in 71. They get 7 starters out of that. You know, they bring in Jack Ham from Penn State. And then in 72, they draft this running back from Penn State named Franco Harris. And Art Rooney Jr. saved the day there because Chuck Noll really wasn't convinced Harris was the guy. He seemed too soft a personality, you know, but Art Rooney insisted, and Art Jr. got his way on this one. And it was a good thing for the Steelers because they never had a losing season again when Franco was on the team. Then in 74, they draft those 4 Hall of Famers. Now the pieces are coming together. And 74 is that year, that breakthrough year when they win the Super Bowl.
The Immaculate Reception was 72?
It was in 72, and it's interesting now, all these years later, it all blurs in people's memories. It's like, oh yeah, the Immaculate Reception happened, then they won the Super Bowl, and they won another one, and then another one, and another one. Not exactly.
They lost the year of the Immaculate
They
Reception.
did. They lost a week later to the Miami Dolphins, Don Shula's unbeaten team, on a fake punt of all things. So after this amazing event, to this day, the Oakland Raiders call it a great American tragedy, right? The Immaculate Reception. It took a while for this to all surge.
Franco Harris, you interviewed him?
I did. Franco Harris is, he is Mr. Pittsburgh, as Joe Greene says. He's involved with so many great causes in this city. And Franco had made the decision that, whichever team drafted him, he was going to go to that city and become a part of that city, really become involved. And it was Pittsburgh that took him. And he started early, getting involved with philanthropic, charitable causes, and he's still doing it 40 years later. He's the social conscience of this team. He's the social glue of this team. Having these Immaculate Reception dinners, trying to bring everyone back together again. Not every player can just blow a whistle and everybody comes. There are only a precious few. Franco could do it, Joe Greene, I think Bradshaw could do it, maybe nobody else. Franco, to meet him, he's like a quiet storm. You feel the power of the man, but there's also a sensitivity there that's unmistakable. And it's very disarming in an interview. And to hear him talk about his teammates, it's clear, very clear and quickly, how much he cares for them.
Oh, how much time did you spend with him?
Well, the first interview alone was 4.5 hours, I think. We met at a hotel in a concierge area. We just sat down, and he was just carried away in the conversation. And I just spent the last 2 days with him in New York on the NFL Today, the CBS, and then we went to Bristol, where ESPN is located. And we did a bunch of interviews there, and just watching Franco move through the room, everyone rushed to him. Dan Marino and Bill Cowher at CBS. When Franco entered the room, it was like the Pope had entered, and Marino's a Hall of Famer himself. And so too at ESPN. It's interesting, at the airport at Pittsburgh, they have that statue of Franco making the Immaculate Reception. It's right next to a statue of General George Washington. And whenever Franco arrives at the airport, if people spot him walking by, the cell phone comes out and it's like, Franco, could I take a picture? He always says yes. And I think that's still a way he gives back to the city.
And you're right about Rocky Bleier being injured in Vietnam?
Rocky Bleier won a Purple Heart in Vietnam. He wasn't real excited about going over there. He had finally made it in the NFL, and in fact, in one of the games after he got his draft notice, he played another game, and he went flying down on kick coverage into the wedge and just hurled his body into the middle, hoping that he'd break a bone that would keep him from having to leave the Steelers and go to war. No bone broke. So off he went, and he was wounded by gunshots and also a grenade. And they said initially he'd never walk again because it was his foot that suffered the majority of it, his thigh and his foot. But he came back, and his story was remarkable. He came back from barely being able to stand up to rushing for more than 1,000 yards in 1976 in an NFL season. And later his life was made into a movie, the Rocky Bleier story. John Stallworth is a very funny guy, and at one of the Mel Blount youth home roasts, he said of Rocky Bleier, always kidding Rocky, they made the Rocky Bleier movie, but Rocky couldn't play the lead because he was too short to play himself. So.
One of the things I wanted to ask about when we were talking about Franco Harris is Franco's Italian Army. How did that get started?
Well, it got started by two local guys, and by the names of Al Vento, a pizza man, and Tony Stagno, his cousin.
Just fans?
Just fans, fans who were tired of losing, and they were looking for a cause, someone to rally behind. And they were Italian, and Franco is Italian. Franco's father was an African-American soldier who was in World War II, and he brought home an Italian war bride, ergo the name Franco Harris. And they approached him and said, we want to start Franco's Italian army. Are you okay with that? And he said, okay, sure. And it was such a colorful time at the ballpark. You know, you had Frenchie Fuqua, Frenchie's Foreign Legion, and Roy Girella's Guerrillas, and Jack Ham, Dobre Shunka, great ham, you know. These ethnic groups coming together. It was a melting pot at the stadium. Remember, this is a time when steel is dying, and so the Steelers are rising at just the right time, and they become the emotional life raft for the region.
And they got Frank Sinatra to come to a practice?
They got Frank Sinatra to come to a practice out at Palm Springs, and Tony Stagno and Al Vento went out there, and they knighted him, and they gave him a helmet, an army helmet. He was officially, I believe, a general in Franco's Italian army. They wanted him to drink the $2 Riunite wine, but Sinatra brought his own wine. I'm not going with that. I'm drinking my own wine.
Should talk a little bit about Mike Webster.
Mike Webster was a much-loved teammate, and he was a remarkable football player, arguably the best or second best center in NFL history. He played 17 seasons at center, a position no man should play for 17 seasons in the National Football League. And sadly, the shorthand numbers of his life, he retired at 40 and he died at 50. And in between, he lost his money, his marriage, and precipitating all of it, his mind. He became the first player in the NFL diagnosed posthumously with chronic traumatic encephalopathy, as it's called, CTE, brain damage. Took too many hits. Center being the most vulnerable position, snapping the ball and up, helmet to helmet, you know, 17 years. And he died in 2002, and so 20 years after the empire, the legacy of that empire darkened, because next to those 4 Super Bowl trophies and those 12 Hall of Fame busts in Canton at the Pro Football Hall of Fame, now must go the laboratory slides of Mike Webster's brain. And it's that reminder that this is a violent game. What it gives, what it takes. What it took, well, it took Mike Webster. What did it give? To a man, these players would all do it again. Every last one of them said they'd do it again. It was worth it. They say that what the game's greatest gift bestowed upon them wasn't the 4 Super Bowl rings. It was each other.
Is there anything the NFL can or should do about head injuries without kind of diminishing the game?
Well, the league is trying to legislate out of existence these hits out in the periphery. They're trying to protect the quarterbacks, the wide receivers, and the defensive backs with those helmet-to-helmet collisions. But, you know, Joe Greene makes a point that the hardest hits, helmet to helmet, are between the tackles. Linemen, you know, like Longhorn Rams hitting. And that's football. You can't legislate that out of existence. You can't, the running back coming up the middle, the linebacker hitting helmet to helmet. Well, you can try to say you can't do that, but sometimes it's hard to even see it because there's just this mass of humanity there. So they're trying. It's a brutal game, and that can't be changed.
When did it start becoming obvious that this golden era of the Steelers was coming to an end?
By 1981, when I happened upon this team in Latrobe, they were all still speaking the party line. They were saying everyone's replaceable. But, you know, history in the 1980s proved that a lie. Some talents are so exquisite, they're not replaceable. You don't replace Joe Greene. You don't replace Lambert, Bradshaw, Ham, Swan, Stallworth, Mel Blount, Webster. The list is long. This was, you know, kind of a football Camelot here. And the Steelers found out in the 80s that this was not easy to replicate.
How many of those core players played for other teams after the Steelers?
Franco Harris played 1 year for Seattle after a contract dispute. And, you know, there's a few famous athletes who went to other teams at the end of their career. Willie Mays, the long-term Giant, played for the New York Mets, and Joe Namath was playing for the Rams and Johnny Unitas for the Chargers. Franco looked ridiculous in that Seattle Seahawks uniform. He didn't look right. And Art Rooney Jr. told me a story about the Chief near the end of his life at his country club. And this was late in the season. And Seattle was playing on TV. And he goes over to the bar area where the TV was mounted above the bar. And his vision wasn't great. And he was just looking up at the screen at Franco playing for Seattle. And he just came back to the table just shaking his head like it should never have happened. Franco Harris should never have left this team. And what a shame that he did.
You said before we started this interview that there's 600 and some bars around the country that are Steelers bars?
Well, there's 677 bars in America that claim to be Steeler bars. And, many of them are owned by former Pittsburgh people who have moved out of town, second, third generation now out of Pittsburgh, and they share this love for the Steelers. And it's more than a love for team. I think it's a love for home. The football is as deep, it runs as deep as the soil here in Western Pennsylvania. It's not a coincidence that Joe Namath and John Unitas and Dan Marino and Joe Montana, all these Hall of Fame quarterbacks are from Western Pennsylvania. There's a reason for that. Football matters deeply here. And the Steelers, particularly that team in the 70s, when you have people who are now 50 years old and older, they connect to those players and to that team because it reminds them of a time and a place. And that place is home.
What number book is this for you?
Number 5.
What are the others?
My books are so different. They're all nonfiction. They share that. The first was a biography of Atlanta and its social conscience called Where Peachtree Meets Sweet Auburn. The second was a narrative about a Delta commuter that crashed in the summer of 1995 with a number of survivors. It was called 9 Minutes, 20 Seconds. The third was a book about sports, my first book about sports, a legendary moment in basketball history, the night the basketball player Wilt Chamberlain scored 100 points in a game. Where?
Hershey, Pennsylvania.
Hershey, PA. Hershey, PA. That's right, against the New York Knicks. My fourth book was set in the Jazz Age in Kansas City, and it was about a murder and a murder trial, and the whole backdrop was the card game of bridge. It was a husband-wife spat that went out of control, and it was a great trial of the century. And my fifth is now in your hand, about the Pittsburgh Steelers. So what I always look for in my books are great characters and tension lines. That's how we live our lives. We all have tension lines, personal, professional, and football is in itself a tension line. Great characters. The Pittsburgh Steelers of the 70s, oh yeah, great characters.
We've been speaking with Gary Pomerantz. He is the author of this book, Their Life's Work, The Brotherhood of the 1970s Pittsburgh Steelers Then and Now. Thank you very much.
Oh, it was great to talk with you. It was fun.